So, the second lecture on the endocrine system is going to cover the physiology of the system. And after some basics on how we classify hormones and how they're released, we're really going to delve into each of those 10 major endocrine glands that we identified in the previous lecture, what hormones each of those glands release, and the function of each of those hormones on their target cells. So our learning objectives for today are to describe the chemical classification of hormones, to describe the mechanisms that control hormone release, and to list and describe the hormones released by those 10 major endocrine glands. So getting started with learning objective number 1, to describe the chemical classification of hormones. So chemically, hormones can be divided into 2 broad classes, those that are soluble or can be dissolved in lipids, and those that are soluble or can be dissolved in water. So if we first think about the structure of these 2 classifications of hormones, our lipid-soluble hormones are mostly derived from cholesterol. You may also see these termed as steroid hormones. Our water-soluble hormones, on the other hand, are mainly derived from either a single amino acid or a peptide, with a peptide just being a small chain of amino acids. When we consider how these hormones are transported in the blood, remembering that our blood plasma is over 90% water, our lipid-soluble hormones, because they can't be dissolved in water, they must be carried by transport proteins in the blood. So because these hormones are attached to a protein, they remain in circulation much longer than our water-soluble hormones, meaning they can exert their effect on their target cells for a much longer duration of time. Our water-soluble hormones, because they can dissolve in the watery blood and circulate in the bloodstream as a free hormone, meaning that it's not attached to a protein or another molecule, these hormones have a much shorter half-life than our lipid-soluble hormones, and they're often degraded by enzymes in the blood. Considering how these hormones act on their target cells or how they bind to their receptors. So because our lipid-soluble hormones can dissolve in lipids, they're able to diffuse through the phospholipid bilayer or the plasma membrane of a cell. And so for this reason, the receptors for these types of hormones are located on the inside of the cell. Wherefore our water-soluble hormones, which can't pass through that phospholipid bilayer, the receptors for these hormones are located on the surface of the plasma membrane as peripheral proteins. So we have our lipid-soluble hormones, which are derived mostly from cholesterol, must be transported in the blood by a transport protein, and can pass through that phospholipid bilayer to reach the receptors on the inside of the target cell. And our water-soluble hormones, which are derived from amino acids and peptides, so proteins. They dissolve into blood plasma, so they can be transported as free hormones just on their own in the bloodstream. And then because they can't pass through that phospholipid bilayer or the plasma membrane, the receptors for these types of hormones are sitting on the surface of the plasma membrane. So taking a look at how these lipid-soluble hormones work, and these hormones are the ones that travel in the blood with a transport protein. So we've got our hormone in the green here, and it's being transported in the blood by this transport protein. So they will arrive at the target cell, and due to their lipophilic nature, or that they can dissolve into lipids, they diffuse straight through that plasma membrane. Inside the cell, they will bind to their receptor. So the receptor is either located in the cytosol or within the nucleus of the cell. When the hormone binds to the receptor, it alters gene expression for that cell. This changed gene expression causes new messenger RNA to be formed, and that messenger RNA then directs the production of a new protein. So you can see our messenger RNA here goes to the ribosomes to produce a new protein. Then it's this newly formed protein that actually alters that target cell's activity and causes the response typical of that specific hormone. So our lipid-soluble hormones, transported in the blood with our transport proteins, can diffuse directly through that phospholipid bilayer of the plasma membrane. They bind to the receptors that are either located in the cytosol or the nucleus of that cell. That binding of the receptor and the hormone causes some kind of altered gene expression. We have the production of new RMNA, which causes a new protein to be formed, and that protein somehow alters that cell's activity. And how it is altered will be dependent on the specific hormone. With our water-soluble hormones, remembering our water-soluble hormones can travel in the blood as a free hormone, so just on their own. But because they cannot pass through that phospholipid bilayer, they must bind to receptors on the surface of that cell. This binding of the hormone to the receptor activates a membrane protein, which we call a G protein. The activated G protein in turn activates adenylate cyclase. So adenylate cyclase here. Now adenylate cyclase converts ATP into cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP then activates one or more protein kinases within the cytosol of the target cell. A protein kinase is simply an enzyme that phosphorylates or adds another phosphate to other proteins within that cell. In this case, the phosphate comes from ATP. So we have our ATP, we donate that phosphate becoming ADP. This phosphorylation of the proteins within the cell then produce a variety of physiological responses which alter that target cell activity and allow the hormone to impart its effect. Now, after a brief period, an enzyme will inactivate that cyclic AMP, so this altered cell activity is turned off, and unless a new hormone molecule binds to that receptor, that hormone will no longer have its effect. Now, with our lipid-soluble and our water-soluble hormones, I don't necessarily want you to be able to repeat this process. I just want you to think about how the structure of the structure of the hormone affects where the receptor is located on the target cell, and the process or the cascade of events that actually then occur for the hormone to have its effect. So I just want you to be aware of these two different types of processes. Now, before we move on, I just wanted to point out the one exception to the classifications that I just listed. So our thyroid hormones, which are called T3 and T4, are actually water-soluble hormones, but they act more like our lipid-soluble hormones. So our thyroid hormones are derived from tyrosine, which is an amino acid. So they are technically our water-soluble hormones. But in saying that, they are actually transported in the blood by a transport protein, and they can diffuse directly through the plasma membrane and bind to receptors on the inside of their target cells. So I just want you to be aware we have these two different classifications, but there is this one exception. Now, moving on to learning objective number 2, and that is to take a look at the mechanisms that control hormone release. So there are 3 ways that hormones are released by their respective endocrine glands. We have neural stimulation, humoral stimulation, and hormonal stimulation. So neural stimulation occurs when an action potential stimulates an endocrine gland. So an example of this is when the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal medulla and epinephrine is released. Humoral stimulation occurs when the concentration of a chemical in the blood triggers the release of a hormone. So an example of humoral stimulation is when our blood calcium levels regulate the secretion of either parathyroid hormone or calcitonin via a negative feedback loop. And we'll talk about those two hormones in a little bit more detail in a second. Our third method of hormone release is our hormonal stimulation. And this occurs when a hormone is regulated by either the presence or the absence of a hormone in the blood. So, for example, we have Adrenocorticotropic Hormone. It's released from our anterior pituitary gland. When this hormone is circulating in the blood, it stimulates the release of cortisol by our Adrenal Cortex. If this hormone is removed from the bloodstream, then cortisol is no longer released in this way. So stimulation by an action potential, stimulation or release by some kind of substance in the blood, typically some kind of ion, and then hormonal stimulation is the regulation of one hormone by the presence or absence of another hormone. So just to give you a bit of a visual to go with those three examples, so this is what our neural stimulation would look like. So we have a sympathetic nerve fiber extending from the spinal cord. It innervates our adrenal medulla, which is this inner portion of our adrenal gland. When stimulated, it stimulates our chromaffin cells, which if you've done regional anatomy and physiology, you will have heard this term before. And that causes the release of our epinephrine from these chromaffin cells. This is an example of our humoral stimulation, so it's also an example of a negative feedback loop. So we have the concentration of calcium within the blood in the middle here. When our blood calcium levels increase, the thyroid gland will release calcitonin. This inhibits our osteoclast activity. It promotes the deposition of calcium back into the bones, and this will lower our blood calcium. Going back the other way, when our blood calcium levels drop too far, we've got our parathyroid glands, which sit on the posterior surface of our thyroid gland, release parathyroid hormone. This inhibits our osteoblast activity and puts the calcium from the bone back into the blood. So this increases our blood calcium levels. Our third example was our hormonal stimulation. And so this is, remember, the presence or the absence of a hormone in the blood. In this example, we had our Adrenocorticotropic Hormone. So this is released from our anterior pituitary gland. When this hormone is in circulation, it stimulates our adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Okay, so now our last learning objective for this entire topic, but I will admit it is a big one, and that is to list and describe the hormones released by those 10 major endocrine glands. So as I mentioned in the previous lecture, these are the 10 major endocrine glands we're going to focus on in this semester. In the last lecture, I simply wanted you to be able to identify each of these glands. In this lecture, I want you to be able to list each of the hormones that these glands secrete and a brief function for each of those hormones. Now, before I get started with the first lot of glands, which were our anterior and posterior pituitary gland, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the hypothalamus and its relationship with the pituitary gland. So remembering our hypothalamus is this structure here. Our pituitary gland with our anterior and posterior portions is this bit down here. So the pituitary gland is one of the most important endocrine glands because it secretes several hormones that control other endocrine glands. However, the pituitary gland itself is also regulated by many hormones from the hypothalamus. So this small region which is kind of in the center of the brain, just below the thalamus. So this round portion here is a thalamus. This kind of little triangle section here is our hypothalamus, is the major link between our nervous system and the endocrine system. So cells in the hypothalamus produce several different hormones, and along with the hormones secreted by the pituitary gland, they play important roles in the regulation of basically everything in the human body. So growth, development, metabolism, all of our homeostasis. Now, when we look at the anterior pituitary gland, so this is our anterior pituitary gland here, it's actually connected to the hypothalamus by this portal system here. Now, what I mean by a portal system is just this collection of capillaries. So what this means is that when the hypothalamus is stimulated, hormones produced in the hypothalamus can be secreted directly into these capillaries, which can then travel directly to the capillaries of the anterior pituitary gland and have its effect on those hormones. So hormones released in the hypothalamus have a direct connection via the blood to the anterior pituitary gland. Now, this is a little bit different to how our posterior pituitary gland works. So our posterior pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus via a collection of nerves. So these axons begin in the hypothalamus and then they extend all the way down to the posterior pituitary gland where they meet the capillaries that we then secrete those hormones into. Now, the posterior pituitary gland doesn't actually produce any of the hormones itself. So the hormones that we produce in the hypothalamus, we then package into vesicles. They move into these neurons, they go down the axon, and they are stored in those axon terminals until a nerve impulse triggers the posterior pituitary gland. It triggers exocytosis, and those hormones are released. So anterior pituitary gland connected by blood to the hypothalamus. Our posterior pituitary gland doesn't produce any of its own hormones, but it's connected to the hypothalamus via a nerve system. But getting back to our list of our major endocrine glands, and our first gland, as I've said, is our anterior pituitary gland. Now, the anterior pituitary gland secretes hormones that regulate a really wide range of bodily functions. The release of hormones from this pituitary gland is stimulated by releasing hormones from the hypothalamus and then suppressed by inhibiting hormones also from the hypothalamus. Anterior pituitary hormones travel throughout the body in the blood to their target tissues. And those that then act on other endocrine glands or other hormones are what we call tropic hormones or trophins. So there are 6 hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary gland that we're going to talk about today. These are the human growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, and adrenocorticotropic hormone. So starting with human growth hormone, this is sometimes also referred to just as HGH. And this hormone is the most plentiful anterior pituitary hormone. So we have the most of this particular hormone. The main function of human growth hormone is to promote the synthesis, so the production and the secretion of a small protein hormone called insulin-like growth factor. Now, in response to human growth hormone, cells in the liver, skeletal muscles, cartilage, bone, and other tissues secrete these insulin-like growth factors, and these growth factors are what causes cells to grow and multiply in all of these different tissues. Human growth hormone is influenced and can also affect blood glucose concentration. So it increases the amount of glucose in the blood. And as human growth hormone stimulates growth, having higher levels of glucose in the blood is really advantageous. Now, human growth hormone is regulated by growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which are both hormones that are released from the hypothalamus. So this making it a hormonal method of hormone release. So just taking a look at what that regulation process looks like. So if we start up the top here, we have low blood glucose. It stimulates the release of our growth hormone releasing hormone from our hypothalamus. That travels in that blood portal system to our anterior pituitary gland, where we then release human growth hormone. Human growth hormone speeds up the breakdown of glycogen in our liver, so it puts that glucose back into the blood. Our blood glucose levels will increase. If that blood glucose continues to increase, that hyperglycemia or really high levels of blood glucose concentration will then work in a negative feedback loop to then inhibit growth hormone releasing hormone. At the same time, if we have high levels of blood glucose concentration, we have the production of growth hormone inhibiting hormone. That inhibits the release of our human growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. This reduces the amount of human growth hormones and those insulin-like growth factors within circulation. It stops the breakdown of that glycogen in the liver. Our blood glucose levels will fall. If that blood glucose level continues to fall, that low blood glucose level will then come back and inhibit the release of our growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which at the same time will cause the release of our growth hormone releasing hormone. It's a bit of a complex negative feedback loop there. The next hormone, which is released by the anterior pituitary gland, is our thyroid stimulating hormone. And as the name suggests, our thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the production and the secretion of our two thyroid hormones, which are T3 and T4. So T3 here, T4 here. Thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus controls the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. Release of thyroid releasing hormone in turn depends on blood levels of T3 and T4. In the case of thyroid stimulating hormone, there is no thyroid inhibiting hormone. And again, this is a hormonal regulation of hormone release. So looking at that process of regulation again, and please don't feel like you need to memorize each of these images. It's just to show you how all of these processes work and how they kind of all interact. So we have low levels of our thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. That stimulates the release of our thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. That acts on our anterior pituitary to release more of our thyroid stimulating hormone. This is another tropic hormone that acts on our thyroid gland to produce more of our thyroid hormones. That increases the number of T3 and T4 or thyroid hormones in our blood. With this increase, then that works as a negative feedback loop to not only directly inhibit thyroid stimulating hormone, but also inhibit thyroid releasing hormone, which then inhibits the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. Next, we have our follicle stimulating hormone, and this is another hormone which tells you a little bit about the function in its name. So in females, follicle stimulating hormone initiates the development of several ovarian follicles each month. So after a female has reached puberty, during each menstrual cycle, we have the maturation of a ovarian follicle. This follicle stimulating hormone is involved in that process. Follicle stimulating hormone also stimulates the follicular cells to secrete estrogen, so one of our female sex hormones. In males, follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the production of sperm in the testes. Now, gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus stimulates follicle stimulating hormone release. Release of this hormone is suppressed by high levels of estrogen in females and high levels of testosterone in males. There is also no gonadotropin inhibiting hormone. Luteinizing hormone is another one of our hormones that is involved in reproduction. So in females, luteinizing hormone triggers ovulation, so the release of an oocyte or an egg from an ovary. Luteinizing hormone also stimulates the formation of the corpus luteum after ovulation. So that's the sac-like structure that's left behind after an egg is ovulated and which temporarily produces progesterone for the body. Together with follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone is also involved in the secretion of estrogen. In our males, luteinizing hormone stimulates cells in the testes to secrete testosterone. And like our follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone is regulated by the release of our gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So because these two hormones are regulated in the same way, we have them on one image here. So we have our gonadotropin releasing hormone produced in the hypothalamus that acts on our anterior pituitary gland to release both follicle stimulating hormone and our luteinizing hormone. Remember, our follicle stimulating hormone will help develop our follicles so an oocyte can mature. It also helps produce our sperm. Our luteinizing hormone helps with the secretion of estrogen as well as the secretion of testosterone. This also works as a bit of a negative feedback loop, so high levels of both estrogen and testosterone will work as a negative feedback to reduce the levels of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, as well as inhibit the release of our gonadotropin releasing hormone. Next, we have prolactin, and prolactin together with other hormones initiate and maintains milk production by the mammary glands both during and then after pregnancy. Now, it helps produce milk, but it doesn't actually help get the milk out. So the actual ejection of milk from the mammary glands depends on the hormone oxytocin, which is released from the posterior pituitary gland and which we will talk about shortly. The hypothalamus secretes both inhibitory and releasing hormones that regulate prolactin secretion. But in females, during pregnancy, prolactin levels will rise, stimulated by a prolactin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Once the baby arrives, the sucking action of the baby on the nipple will cause a reduction in the secretion of prolactin inhibiting hormone, so you have more of that prolactin produced. In males do produce prolactin, but we don't really know what the function of this hormone is. What we do know is that hypersecretion of prolactin can cause erectile dysfunction issues. Now, adrenocorticotropic hormone, so also referred to as ACTH, controls the production and the secretion of cortisol and other hormones by the cortex of the adrenal glands. So if you break down the name of this hormone, we've got adrenal cortex, and tropic is a hormone that stimulates another hormone. So this hormone stimulates the production of hormones from the adrenal cortex. Corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus will stimulate the release of ACTH. Stress-related stimuli, so things like low blood glucose or physical trauma, as well as proteins produced in response to inflammation, can also stimulate the release of this hormone. High levels of cortisol and other hormones released from the adrenal cortex will inhibit the corticotropin releasing hormone and therefore inhibit the release of ACTH via negative feedback. So looking at that process here, we have our corticotropin releasing hormone in our hypothalamus. It acts on our anterior pituitary gland to release our adrenocorticotropic hormone. That hormone acts on the adrenal cortex, which remember is that outer layer of our adrenal glands, to produce cortisol and some of our other hormones. When we have high levels of cortisol, that works as a negative feedback to both directly inhibit our adrenocorticotropic hormone as well as inhibit that corticotropin releasing hormone. Now moving on to the posterior pituitary gland, and remember that the posterior pituitary doesn't produce its own hormones, but it does store and release two different hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus. So these hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So the first hormone that we will look at from the posterior pituitary gland is oxytocin. So oxytocin you will have heard about in the homeostasis lecture when we talked about positive feedback loops. So during childbirth, the stretching of the cervix of the uterus stimulates the release of oxytocin, which in turn enhances the contraction of the smooth muscles in the uterus wall, which then pushes that baby further down onto that cervix and causes more stretching, meaning we have more and more oxytocin produced. After the delivery of the baby, oxytocin is also involved in the ejection of milk from the mammary glands, and this occurs in response to the mechanical stimulation provided by that infant sucking. Now, the function of oxytocin in males and in non-pregnant females is not entirely clear. We do have experiments in animals that do suggest it may actually foster or promote caretaking behaviours in parents, so to actually help either a father or a non-pregnant guardian to care for their infant. You may have also heard of oxytocin as being the love hormone, as it's believed it is somewhat responsible for those feelings of pleasure and love after things like intercourse. The method of hormone release for oxytocin is neural. So the mechanical stimulation of receptors in the cervix and the nipple will stimulate the production and the release of this hormone via the hypothalamus and then from the posterior pituitary gland. The other hormone released by the posterior pituitary gland is antidiuretic hormone, also referred to as ADH. And so a diuretic is a substance that causes increase in urination. So in this case, an antidiuretic is a hormone that reduces the need to urinate. So we will look at this particular hormone in much more detail when we come to the urinary system, but essentially how ADH works is that it increases the amount of water being reabsorbed in the kidneys so that more water stays in our blood and less is lost in urine. So we're having that reduced need to urinate. If we didn't have any ADH, urine output would increase by more than tenfold. So instead of urinating kind of 1 to 2 litres a day, you would urinate up to 20 litres a day. So ADH is obviously really important for us to stay hydrated. Alcohol inhibits the release of antidiuretic hormone, which explains why when you have a drink, you need to go to the bathroom more often and why you can end up being really dehydrated after a big night out. Going the other way, the release of ADH is stimulated by increased plasma osmolarity and decreased blood volume. So that just means when you've got more kind of substances, so cells and other things in the blood and less water. And when you have less water in the blood, you're going to have less blood volume. So this is a humoral method of hormone release. The next gland we're looking at is also up in the brain, and this is our pineal gland. So if we're looking, this is kind of the middle section of the brain here, and they've taken a bit more of a zoomed in image here. So we've got our pituitary gland and our hypothalamus on this side. Our pineal gland is this little white structure more posterior. And there's only one hormone that we're going to look at in relation to the pineal gland, and that is melatonin. So the pineal gland secretes melatonin, which is a hormone derived from serotonin. Melatonin appears to contribute to the setting of the body's biological clock. And as more melatonin is released when it's dark compared to when it's light, like during the day, it's believed that this hormone is associated with sleepiness. So this hormone is stimulated by the nervous system. It has a neural method of hormone release. And in particular, visual input to the occipital lobe, so from bright light as occurs during the day, is thought to inhibit the release of melatonin, which is why they suggest don't have your phone too close to your face or use a bright screen too late at night, because it will inhibit the release of melatonin. And we have a peak in melatonin concentration late at night. Now, small doses of melatonin can be given orally. So you can actually buy melatonin over the counter to help induce sleep and kind of reset your daily sleep cycle when you've done things like shift working or you're a bit jet lagged. Melatonin levels are also higher in children and then decline as we get older, which may explain why children sleep more and why we often struggle to get to sleep and then stay asleep as we age. Next, we have the thyroid gland. So that was this butterfly-shaped gland, which is on the anterior surface of the neck, just kind of down from the voice box, which sits in this part here. And there are two thyroid hormones we're going to look at today. Our thyroid hormones, which are T3 and T4, which we've mentioned briefly already, and then calcitonin. So our thyroid hormones, which we call T3 and T4, and are named as such because T3 contains 3 atoms of iodine and T4 contains 4 atoms of iodine, are collectively known as our thyroid hormones. So they're released in the same way and they have the same functions, so we kind of group them together. These hormones increase our basal metabolic rate. So this is the bare number of kilojoules that your body needs to stay functioning. So to do all the things your body needs to do to keep you alive, this is the bare amount of energy that your body needs to do those things. Thyroid hormones also have an effect on cell growth, so it can increase cell growth and also, and also increase the production of body heat. Our thyroid hormones are under hormonal control and are regulated by the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone, which we've talked about already, which is released from the anterior pituitary gland. So we've looked at that image already, but our low levels of thyroid hormone, so T3 and T4, stimulate the thyroid-releasing hormone, which stimulates the release of our thyroid-stimulating hormone, which stimulates the production of T3 and T4 in our thyroid glands. That increases the amount of thyroid hormone in our bloodstream, which then works as a negative feedback loop to inhibit thyroid stimulating hormone and inhibit that thyroid releasing hormone. Calcitonin is the other hormone produced and released by the thyroid gland. So calcitonin works to decrease the amount of calcium in the blood. And it does this by reducing the calcium excreted by the kidneys, by promoting the deposition or the storage of calcium in our bones, as well as inhibiting the calcium absorbed by the intestines. The secretion of calcitonin is controlled by a negative feedback loop. So when blood calcium levels are high, calcitonin is released, and it has these actions to reduce blood calcium. When blood calcium levels go back down, calcitonin is no longer produced and released. Calcitonin also works in partnership with parathyroid hormone, which we're going to talk about next, which does the opposite. So it acts to increase blood calcium levels. So the parathyroid glands, which remember were these green dots, these 4 green dots on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. And there's only one hormone that we're going to look at for the parathyroid hormone, and thankfully it's quite easy to remember. It's simply called the parathyroid hormone. So as I mentioned, parathyroid hormone works in tandem with calcitonin to regulate the levels of calcium as well as phosphate to a degree in the blood. The specific action of parathyroid hormone is to increase the number and the activity of osteoclasts. So for those who haven't done regional anatomy and physiology, these are cells that break down the bone matrix and then release the calcium and the phosphate back into the blood. Parathyroid hormone can also increase calcium absorption in the kidneys. As again, we have already mentioned, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin are regulated by the concentration of calcium in the blood. So together, they work in a negative feedback loop to maintain homeostasis of calcium, so are a humoral method of hormone release. Visually representing that relationship for you here. So we have high levels of calcium in the blood. They stimulate the thyroid gland to release more calcitonin. The calcitonin then will inhibit the osteoclasts, so that breaking down of the calcium in the blood. That will then lower our blood calcium levels. When we have too low blood calcium levels, we release our parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone then promotes the release of calcium from that bone extracellular matrix, as well as the reabsorption of calcium in our kidneys. So calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, they kind of work as opposites. Silly way that I always remember which does which is that P for parathyroid hormone puts the calcium back into the blood. Our next gland is the adrenal gland, and remember these glands consist of two distinct regions. We have the adrenal cortex, which is the outer layer of the adrenal gland, and then the adrenal medulla, which is that middle section. So taking a look at the adrenal cortex first, and there are three hormones, or I guess types of hormones that we're going to take a look at. We have aldosterone, which is a mineralocorticoid, and this affects the balance of particular minerals within our body. We have cortisol, which is a glucocorticoid, and this regulates our metabolism and our resistance to stress. And then we have our androgens, which are like weak sex hormones. So aldosterone is the main mineralocorticoid. It regulates homeostasis of two minerals, sodium and potassium. And by regulating the amount of sodium and potassium in our blood, it helps adjust our blood pressure and our blood volume. So similar to antidiuretic hormone, we will cover this particular hormone in much more detail when we get to the urinary system. But essentially, how aldosterone works is that in the kidneys, it helps us reabsorb more sodium back into the blood. If we have more sodium in the blood, more water will start moving into the blood. If we have more water in our blood, we have a greater blood volume. If we have a greater blood volume, we have a greater blood pressure. So we reabsorb more sodium, we excrete the potassium, the water follows the sodium, we increase blood volume, and we increase blood pressure. This hormone is a hormonal method of hormone release. So it's controlled by the presence of angiotensin II, which is another hormone, and it's primarily this hormone that causes the release of aldosterone. Our second hormone from the adrenal cortex is cortisol, and cortisol makes up about 95% of all glucocorticoids. Cortisol has a number of different effects on the body. So it can increase protein breakdown, mostly the breakdown of muscle fibers, and that puts the amino acids that were in the muscle fibers back into the blood. It increases the formation of glucose, and so therefore increases our blood glucose concentration. It increases the breakdown of fat and the release of fatty acids into the blood. It works to provide resistance to stress by having those ready sources of fuel in the blood, so the fatty acids and the glucose, so that we can produce ATP. And high concentrations of cortisol, particularly over a prolonged period of time, can actually depress the immune response. So sometimes when a person will have an organ transplant, they will sometimes receive an injection of cortisol because it actually helps dampen the immune response. The secretion of cortisol is regulated by the concentration of that Adrenocorticotropic, or that ACTH hormone, from the Anterior Pituitary Gland. High levels of cortisol will then inhibit that ACTH release. The corticotropic hormone, which stimulates the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, is also released in response to a variety of physical and emotional stresses, which in turn, I guess, along that long pathway of corticotropic releasing hormones, ACTH, and then cortisol, can have an effect on that cortisol release. So it's a bit of a stress hormone. Our third hormone from the adrenal cortex are our androgens, also known as sex hormones. In both males and females, small amounts of these weak androgens are released. But after puberty in males, the androgen testosterone is released in much greater quantities by the testes. So the amount of androgens actually released by the adrenal glands in males is usually so low that it doesn't even have an effect. So we kind of tend to ignore the effect of the androgen testosterone on males. In females, however, adrenal androgens do play some important roles. They are thought to promote libido and are converted into estrogens by other body tissues. So after menopause, when the secretion of estrogen by the ovaries stops, all female estrogen comes from the conversion of adrenal androgens. Adrenal androgens also stimulate the growth of pubic hair in both boys and girls and contributes to that growth spurt that we see just before puberty. Although the control of androgens is not fully understood, the main hormone that releases or that causes the release of our androgens is that Adrenocorticotropic Hormone, or that ACTH. Therefore, it does come under the banner of hormonal regulation. Moving on to the adrenal medulla, so the inner portion of that adrenal gland, and this is under the control of the sympathetic nervous system. The hormone-producing cells within the adrenal medulla are called our chromaffin cells, and they are innervated by neurons of the autonomic nervous system. So when the sympathetic nervous system stimulates those cells, they cause the release of two hormones really quickly, these hormones being epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, you may have also heard these hormones termed adrenaline and noradrenaline. They are the same things. In Australia, we typically refer to them as epinephrine and norepinephrine. Typically in the US, you might hear adrenaline and noradrenaline. So the chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla release both epinephrine and norepinephrine. They secrete about 80% of epinephrine and then 20% of norepinephrine. Because these two hormones are released in the same way and have the same effects, again, we kind of group them together. So the effect of these hormones is that they intensify the sympathetic response that occurs in all different parts of the body with that flight or fight response. So that could be to increase your heart rate, increase blood flow to the heart, to the liver, to skeletal muscles, to dilate your airways, dilate your pupils, to increase blood glucose concentration, anything that you would need in an emergency or stressful situation. In stressful situations, the nerve impulses from the sympathetic neurons will stimulate those chromaffin cells, causing these hormones to be released. So as such, these hormones are under that neural control. The next endocrine gland is the pancreas. So as I mentioned in the previous lecture, the pancreas, which makes up part of our gastrointestinal system, has both endocrine and exocrine functions. We'll talk about the endocrine function in this lecture and then the exocrine function when we get to the gastrointestinal system. So there are 4 hormones which the pancreas will release, but we are actually going to only focus on 2. So they are glucagon and insulin. Our glucagon is secreted by the alpha cells of the pancreas, and our insulin is secreted by the beta cells of the pancreas. So the principal action of glucagon is to increase blood glucose levels when it falls below normal. So low blood glucose or hypoglycemia will stimulate the secretion of glucagon from those alpha cells of the pancreas. Glucagon acts on liver cells to accelerate the conversion of glycogen into glucose, as well as the formation of glucose from things like lactic acid and different amino acids. So as a result, the liver will release glucose into the blood, and we've got glucose being formed in other ways, so our blood glucose levels will rise quite rapidly. If blood glucose levels continue to rise, the release of glucagon is inhibited. So it is a humoral method of hormone release. Opposing the action of glycogen then is insulin. So high blood glucose concentration stimulates the secretion of insulin by the beta cells of the pancreas. Insulin acts on various cells in the body to accelerate the diffusion of glucose into the cells, as well as speed up the conversion of glucose into glycogen, which is our stored form of glucose. As a result of these actions, blood glucose concentration will drop. And similar to glucagon, if blood glucose levels drop too far below normal, the low blood glucose will actually inhibit the release of the insulin via negative feedback and then start to stimulate the release of glucagon. So glucagon and insulin working in tandem. Seeing that interaction or that partnership here, so low blood glucose, so hypoglycemia, will cause those alpha cells to secrete glucagon. Glucagon acts to convert glycogen into glucose, so it breaks down stored glycogen and puts it into glucose into the blood. We also produce glucose from another of other sources. Our glucose levels will then rise. If they continue to rise, we have an inhibition of our glucagon release. At the same time, we have our high blood glucose stimulating the beta cells to secrete insulin. Insulin will take the glucose out of the blood and put it into cells. It will help take the glucose and store it as glycogen. Our blood glucose concentration will fall. If it continues to fall, that low blood glucose will inhibit the release of insulin and then start to stimulate the release of glucagon. And lastly, we have our two reproductive endocrine glands, so the ovaries and the testes. So starting with the ovaries here. And the ovaries are those two paired oval structures that sit in the pelvic cavity of a female. They produce several steroid hormones, including estrogen and progesterone, which are the ones that we're going to talk about today. So like a number of other hormones we've spoken about today, we will cover estrogen and progesterone in much greater depth when we come to the reproductive systems. But for the purpose of today, we are going to group these two hormones together. So these are two of our female sex hormones, which along with follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone regulate things like the menstrual cycle. They help maintain pregnancy. They help prepare the mammary glands for lactation. They also promote things like the enlargements of breasts and the widening of hips at puberty, and then help maintain these secondary female sex characteristics. So what a stereotypical female looks like. The secretion of estrogen and progesterone are regulated by the hormones follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which both come from the anterior pituitary gland. And working as kind of a big group of four, these produce a variety of effects related to reproduction. This image, I am not going to scare you too much just yet. I just wanted to highlight the complexity of the female reproductive system and how the hormones kind of all interact and rely on one another. So we have our gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is produced in the hypothalamus. That acts on our anterior pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone, remember, helps mature those follicles. Luteinizing hormone is what triggers ovulation. Both of these hormones then help the production of estrogen and progesterone, which has a number of effects on our menstrual cycle, like thickening and maintaining the lining of our uterus in the case of a pregnancy. Finally, we have the testes, which are our male reproductive organs and which produce the majority of the hormone testosterone. Testosterone stimulates the descent of the testes before birth. It regulates production of sperm. It also stimulates the development and the maintenance of the male secondary sex characteristics, so things like the growth of facial hair and the voice getting deeper. Our luteinizing hormone stimulates particular cells in the testes to produce testosterone, and so it's a hormonal method of release. Just to show that the male reproductive system can be just as complex as the female reproductive system, and that, interaction between all the sex hormones. So we have that gonadotropin releasing hormone again being released by the hypothalamus, stimulating the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Our follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the production of sperm. Our luteinizing hormone stimulates particular cells in the testes to produce testosterone. So these are going to have a variety of effects throughout the body, but then when we have an increase in our levels of testosterone, it works as a negative feedback loop to inhibit both the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone and our gonadotropin releasing hormone. Now, 56 minutes? That is the end of the physiology of the endocrine system lecture. I appreciate that was a lot. There are lots of endocrine glands, lots of hormones, and lots of functions to remember. I just want to point out that we will go over pretty much all of this again in the labs. So we're going to look at a few case studies and conditions involving either over or under secretion of these hormones, as well as what happens with normal secretions of these hormones. We're also going to show you ways that you can actually synthesize all of this information onto kind of 1 or 2 pages of a table or a mind map. I also want to point out that we will return to many of these hormones when we come to look at the other organ systems. So don't fret just now if you're a little bit overwhelmed and you're thinking, how could I ever remember all this information? This is information we will be repeating over and over throughout the semester. So good job for getting through the first organ system, and I shall see you all in the labs.